Have you ever seen a picture of a warship that looked like a zebra having an argument with a chessboard? Jagged lines of black and white, slabs of blue and green crashing into each other, curves that make no sense. It's not a mistake, it's not a celebration, it's a weapon. During the World Wars, the sea was a terrifyingly open place. A ship is just a black silhouette against a bright sky. You can't hide it. So, a British artist named Norman Wilkinson had a radical idea. What if you stopped trying to hide? What if instead you tried to confuse? This gave birth to Dazzle Camouflage. The goal wasn't to make a ship invisible. Like, the goal was to make it impossible to hit. To make a submarine captain staring through a periscope doubt his own eyes. Which way is it going? How fast is it moving? Is that one ship or two? By the time he figured it out, the torpedo would miss. It was a desperate, brilliant, and deeply strange solution to a deadly problem. It was an art war fought with paintbrushes and optical illusions on the biggest canvases in the world, the steel hulls of ships. This is the story of that art war, a story of how abstract art went to sea and became a tool of survival. We'll look at 17 of these floating masterpieces, these legitimately trippy designs that turned naval warfare into a surrealist exhibition. Why would making a ship more visible possibly make it safer? And did this crazy, beautiful idea actually work? Number 5, what happens when war becomes an art gallery? The fighting stopped. The world took a long, deep breath, and the Dazzle ships came home. Their wild patterns, once a matter of life and death, were now just paint. Most were scraped clean and returned to a sensible uniform gray. The great experiment seemed to be over. But was it? The ideas behind Dazzle didn't just vanish. They seeped into the culture. They bled from the dockyards into the art galleries and fashion houses. The war had, for a brief strange moment, made the whole ocean a modern art museum, and people had noticed. One of the key figures in this transition was Edward Wadsworth. He was a British artist, one of the founding members of the Vorticist movement. Vorticism was all about hard lines, machine-age energy, and dynamic motion. It was a perfect fit for Dazzle. During the First World War, Wadsworth supervised the application of Dazzle schemes in Bristol and Liverpool. He painted his own canvases of these bizarre ships, like his famous work Dazzle Ships in Dry Dock at Liverpool from 1919. The painting is a masterpiece of Vorticism. It's a dizzying composition of intersecting planes and powerful diagonals. The ships are almost indistinguishable from the docks and cranes around them. It's a perfect visual summary of what Dazzle was trying to do, break down a familiar shape into confusing components. He wasn't just documenting the camouflage, he was celebrating the aesthetic it had accidentally created. This connection to modern art wasn't a coincidence. The artists who designed Dazzle were drawing from the same well as the Cubists and Futurists. They were all interested in fracturing reality and showing an object from multiple viewpoints at once and breaking down form. A ship like the USS West Mahomet, with its chaotic blocks of color and a false bow wave painted halfway down its hull, looks like a floating Georges Braque painting. The French, in particular, saw the link clearly. The artist Everett Warner, who led the design section for the U.S. Navy, noted that the French were far more likely to employ curving, distorted lines in their camouflage, which he felt had a more artistic and less scientific feel. They were playing with form in a way that painters in Paris were. After the wars, this aesthetic resurfaced in unexpected places. In the 1960s, the op art movement, with artists like Bridget Riley, explored optical illusions that seemed to vibrate and move. Her black and white patterns create a sense of unease and motion, the very same feelings a Dazzle pattern was meant to evoke in a U-boat commander. The link is direct. The military had weaponized optical art decades before the term even existed. Fashion picked up on it too. The bold graphic patterns of the 60s mod look owe a debt to the high contrast geometry of Dazzle. A dress with stark black and white stripes that break up the form of the human body is using the exact same principle as the HMS Argus, an aircraft carrier whose hull was covered in a mind-bending pattern of swooping bands. Even the military hasn't entirely forgotten it. While radar and guided missiles made Dazzle obsolete for a time, the core idea of confusing a targeting system is still valid. In the 21st century, some navies have experimented with modern versions of Dazzle. The Royal Navy has tested Dazzle-esque patterns on ships to confuse pirates' aim in small boat attacks. The United States Navy painted a littoral combat ship, the USS Freedom, in a complex pattern of blue and gray geometric shapes. It's not designed to fool a periscope, but to make it harder to judge the ship's speed and heading from a distance, or perhaps to confuse modern imaging sensors. The war may be different, the technology may have changed, but the human brain, or even the computer brain, can still be tricked. The legacy of Dazzle is this strange dual life. It was a practical tool of war, born of desperation. But it was also one of the largest scale art projects in human history. It proved that creativity and aesthetics could have a place even in the grimmest of human endeavors. It showed that sometimes the most effective solution isn't the most obvious one. It's not about being stronger or tougher. It's about being smarter, stranger, and more creative. The Dazzle ships were a testament to the power of a weird idea. They sailed as floating paradoxes, daring the enemy to make sense of them. And then they came home and quietly reshaped the way we see the world. But what if the most effective patterns were secretly the ones the artists themselves found most beautiful? How much did pure aesthetics, a desire to create a striking image, override scientific principles in the design rooms? Could a new form of digital dazzle, designed to fool artificial intelligence, be the next great artistic movement in warfare? And what happened to the thousands of original Dazzle Plan documents and miniature models? Are they gathering dust in a forgotten archive, a lost gallery of military art? Number 4, who were the mad geniuses with the paintbrushes? It wasn't a scientist or an engineer who came up with Dazzle. It was a painter. Norman Wilkinson, a British marine artist and Royal Navy volunteer, was the man who changed everything. He was a traditional painter, he loved the sea, and he knew how to paint ships, so they looked real. He understood light, water, and shadow. And in 1917, while staring out at the water, he had a moment of profound insight. He was on a patrol boat, and he realized everyone was trying to solve the wrong problem. The German U-boats were sinking hundreds of Allied ships a month. The dominant idea for protection was camouflage in the traditional sense, trying to make a ship invisible. But Wilkinson knew this was impossible. A ship at sea is always a dark shape against a bright sky. There is no hiding. So he flipped the question. Instead of asking, "How can I hide this ship?" he asked, "How can I make this ship impossible to hit?" His answer was Dazzle, or razzle-dazzle, as it was sometimes called. He reasoned that if you painted a ship in jarring, contradictory patterns, it would be incredibly difficult for a U-boat commander to judge its course, speed, and range. The commander had to look through a periscope, estimate these factors by eye, and then fire a torpedo that would travel for a minute or two to intercept the ship's future position. If you could make him misjudge the ship's course by just a few degrees, the torpedo would miss. Wilkinson pitched his idea to the British Admiralty. At first, they were skeptical. It sounded like madness. Make our ships more visible. But the losses were catastrophic, and they were willing to try anything. So they gave him a chance. He set up a workshop, not in a naval laboratory, but in a studio at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. Here, he assembled a team of other artists, model makers, and naval officers. This was the heart of the British Dazzle project. The process was part art, part science. They would take a miniature model of a ship, say a merchant vessel like the SS Ceramic. Then an artist would paint a wild pattern on it. The model would be placed on a turntable in a specially constructed viewing theater. A naval officer would look at the rotating model through a periscope, simulating the view from a submarine. They would try to judge its heading. The artist would watch, take notes, and then go back to the model, tweaking the design. They would try another pattern. Maybe this time the stripes on the bow would be thicker. Maybe a fake wave should be painted near the stern. It was a process of trial and error. The goal was to create maximum confusion. When they found a design that consistently baffled the observer in the studio, the plan was scaled up and sent to the shipyards, where painters would reproduce the bizarre pattern on the real vessel. In the United States, a similar process unfolded, led by the artist Everett Warner. He established the camouflage section of the U.S. Navy in Washington, D.C. Like Wilkinson, he recruited other artists. A significant portion of his team was made up of women, who painted the thousands of wooden models used for testing. They worked in what they called a BC system, low visibility, coarse distortion, and blending with the horizon, but coarse distortion dazzle was by far the most radical and widely used. American designs often had their own flavor. They tended to use more angular, geometric shapes, a style that some have linked to the growing influence of American modernism. A ship like the USS Leviathan, a massive troop transport, and a former German ocean liner was covered in a dizzying array of swooping curves and jagged blocks. It looked less like a ship and more like a chaotic geographical map. These were not just random scribbles. The designers followed certain principles. Vertical lines near the bow or stern could make it seem like the ship was moving at a different angle. A painted bow wave in the middle of the ship could suggest it was shorter and moving faster than it was. Contrasting colors could break up the ship's structure, making it hard to even identify what kind of vessel it was. Was that a destroyer or a cruiser? The answer determined the torpedo settings. A ship like the troopship RMS Mauritania received a complex pattern of abstract shapes that completely disrupted its elegant lines, turning a famous passenger liner into a geometric nightmare for any enemy observer. These artists were waging a different kind of war. Their weapons were color theory, perspective, and optical illusion. They were fighting against the cognitive shortcuts of the human brain. They knew that the brain wants to see a complete shape, that it wants to interpret lines as indicating direction. They used that knowledge to lie. Every painted line was a calculated falsehood. They were, in essence, weaponizing art. And for a few short years, the oceans of the world became their canvas. But what secret rivalries existed between the British and American camouflage sections? Did they share their best designs, or did they compete to create the most effective optical illusions? How many artists who worked on these top secret projects were never publicly recognized for their contributions? And did Norman Wilkinson ever stand on a cliff, watching one of his dazzled ships sail out to sea, and wonder if his beautiful, crazy idea would actually save the men on board? Number 3. How do you trick a human brain at 10,000 yards? Dazzle Camouflage was not magic. It was a carefully engineered attack on the human brain's visual processing system. And to understand why it worked, you have to understand the problem from the perspective of the man looking through the periscope. A U-boat commander in World War I or II didn't have a computer. He had his eyes, a stopwatch, a rotating prism in his periscope called a stadimeter for estimating range, and a circular slide rule called an is-was for calculating the torpedo's path. His entire attack depended on 3 crucial pieces of information he had to guess: the target's range, its speed, and its course. Dazzle was designed to screw up all 3. Let's start with the course. This was the most important one. The U-boat commander needed to know the angle on the bow of the target ship. Is it heading straight at me, straight away, or somewhere in between? He needed to lead the target, like a hunter leading a bird. If he got the angle wrong by just a few degrees, the torpedo, which was unguided, would swim harmlessly past the stern or bow. Dazzle patterns used a host of tricks to confuse this judgment. A classic example is the USS Nebraska, a battleship whose hull was painted with a series of slanting, diagonal stripes. These stripes did not align with the ship's actual structure. Looking at it, the brain struggles. The stripes suggest one direction of travel, while the ship's superstructure, the funnels and masts, suggest another. This creates a cognitive dissonance. The commander's brain is fed 2 conflicting pieces of information, and the resulting confusion could cause a fatal miscalculation. Some ships, like the French cruiser Gloire, used huge curving patterns that swept up from the waterline, making it incredibly difficult to tell where the bow ended and the midship began. Then there was speed. How do you judge the speed of a ship from miles away? You watch it move against the vertical crosshair in your periscope in time, how long it takes for the bow, and then the stern to pass. But what if you can't tell where the bow and stern are? Dazzle patterns deliberately broke up the ship's outline. A ship like the USS Omaha had a pattern with a huge patch of dark color in the middle and lighter colors at the ends. This makes the ship appear shorter than it is. A shorter ship crossing the crosshair in the same amount of time would be judged as moving slower than it actually is. The torpedo would be fired behind it. Another trick was the false bow wave. Some ships had a white curling wave painted on the side of the hull, far back from the actual bow. The eye is naturally drawn to this as the point of motion, leading to a completely wrong estimate of speed and course. Finally, there was range and identification. Before firing, the commander needed to identify the class of ship to estimate its length and normal cruising speed. The Dazzle made this hard. Patterns were designed to disguise the ship's features. A large, dark shape painted over a gun turret could make it disappear. A jagged line cutting across a funnel could make it look like it was in a different place. The troopship RMS Olympic, sister ship to the Titanic, was a prize target. Its dazzle scheme, a chaotic mesh of blue, gray, black, and green, was meant to break up its massive, unmistakable 4-funnel silhouette. The goal was to make the U-boat commander hesitate. Is that the Olympic, or is it a smaller, less important vessel? That moment of hesitation was time the ship could use to escape. A 2011 study by researchers at the University of Bristol recreated the conditions of a U-boat attack using computer simulations. They showed people images of dazzled ships and asked them to judge their speed. The results showed that certain dazzle patterns, particularly high contrast ones, did indeed cause people to consistently misjudge speed. It wasn't a huge effect, but it was real. You know, in a battle where a few knots of miscalculation meant, you know, the difference between a direct hit and a clean miss, a small effect could be enough. The science of dazzle was the science of perception. It understood that seeing isn't a passive act of recording reality like a camera. It's an active process of interpretation. The brain takes in messy, incomplete data and uses experience and shortcuts to build a coherent picture. The dazzle fed the brain bad data. It was a lie painted in oil and steel, a visual virus designed to infect the decision-making process of the enemy. It was psychological warfare on a grand optical scale. But how did the effectiveness of a pattern change with the weather? Did a scheme designed for a bright, sunny day become useless on a gray, overcast afternoon? Were some U-boat commanders simply immune to the illusions? Their brains wired differently? And could the very strangeness of the patterns have sometimes frozen a commander with indecision, an effect that can't be measured by simple speed and course judgments? Number 2, why paint a target on your back? The idea of painting a warship with loud, garish patterns seems insane. War is about stealth. It's about hiding, blending in, striking from the shadows. Why would you ever do the opposite? The answer lies in the unique and desperate situation of naval warfare in the early 20th century, specifically the terror of the German U-boat. In the First World War, the submarine came of age as a truly devastating weapon. By 1917, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships at an apocalyptic rate. In April of that year alone, they sank 881,000 tons of shipping. Britain, an island nation, was facing starvation. The lifeline of supplies and soldiers from across the Atlantic was being severed. The old ways of protecting ships were failing. A ship on the open ocean is a terribly vulnerable thing. Against the vast, empty backdrop of the sea and sky, it is a stark black dot. Early attempts at camouflage followed the logic of land warfare, try to blend in. Ships were painted gray to match the color of the sea mist. Some were painted pale blue or white to match the sky. This was known as low visibility camouflage. It worked to a degree. A gray ship was harder to spot on a cloudy day than a black one, but it was never a perfect solution. The sea and sky are constantly changing color. A ship that is camouflaged for a gray morning will stick out like a sore thumb in a bright sunset. And once a U-boat got close enough to see the ship, no matter its color, it was a clear silhouette against the horizon. The problem wasn't just being seen, it was being targeted. This is the crucial distinction that Norman Wilkinson understood. He realized that concealment at sea was a fool's errand, so he proposed to abandon it entirely. He argued that since the enemy will inevitably see you, the goal should be to confuse them when they do. This was the birth of Dazzle. It was a strategy of high visibility, low targetability. Instead of making the ship hard to see, you make it hard to understand. Imagine the psychological effect. A U-boat commander surfaces. He has been hunting for days in a cramped, smelly metal tube. He raises his periscope. He expects to see the familiar shape of a merchant freighter or warship. Instead, he sees something that looks like it has been shattered and put back together wrong. A ship, like the HMS Kildongan, was painted with bold, slanting stripes that ran contrary to the lines of the hull, making it look tilted even when it was on an even keel. Or consider the American supply ship, the USS West Shore, whose hull was a dizzying collection of rectangles and trapezoids. It was a visual shock. It forced the commander to stop and analyze what he was seeing, to fight his own instincts. This was not just for warships. The most important vessels to protect were the troop transports and merchant ships. The USS Agamemnon, a captured German liner turned American troop ship, carried thousands of soldiers on each voyage. Its dazzle pattern was a wild series of jagged, interlocking shapes, a desperate attempt to protect its precious cargo. The same went for the oil tankers, whose flammable cargo was essential to the war effort. The USS Sarah Thompson, an oiler, was given a scheme of wavy, disruptive bands. Each of these ships was a floating experiment, a gamble that confusion was a better defense than invisibility. The adoption of Dazzle was a sign of the sheer desperation of the Allied naval situation. They were losing the war at sea. As traditional methods had failed, they needed a radical new idea, and Wilkinson's artistic, counterintuitive concept was the best one they had. So, by 1918, thousands of ships were sailing the Atlantic in their bizarre liveries. Convoys of these Dazzle ships must have been one of the strangest sights of the war, a fleet of optical illusions steaming into harm's way. The crews themselves had mixed feelings. Some felt that the bright paint made them a more obvious target, but others reportedly felt a sense of pride and confidence. Their ship was special. It was using the latest, most advanced form of defense. It was a psychological boost for them, as much as it was a psychological weapon against the enemy. But did the High Command ever seriously consider that Dazzle might be attracting more U-boat attacks by making ships so conspicuous from a distance? How did the men who had to paint these incredibly complex patterns, often in a hurry in busy shipyards, feel about their strange task? And what was the very first U-boat commander's report back to headquarters after encountering a Dazzle ship? Did they think it was a new secret weapon, a strange national flag, or simply that the Allies had gone insane? Number 1, can a coat of paint win a war? Look at a photograph of the USS Charles S. Sperry, a destroyer from the Second World War. It doesn't look like a warship. It looks like an art project. Huge, jagged splinters of white and gray seem to tear the ship apart. The bow seems to point one way, while the stern seems to be twisting in another. The whole structure of the ship, a deadly machine of speed and firepower, is lost in a sea of visual noise. This is Dazzle Camouflage at its most extreme, and it raises the most fundamental question: could something as simple as a coat of paint, an idea born in an artist's studio, actually change the outcome of a naval battle? The answer is complicated. Dazzle wasn't a magic bullet. A dazzled ship could still be seen, still be targeted, and still be sunk. But war isn't about magic bullets, it's about tipping the odds, even slightly. The British Admiralty conducted a statistical analysis after the First World War. They found that of all the ships over 10,000 tons that were attacked by submarines, the percentage of dazzle-painted ships sunk was slightly lower than for conventionally painted ships. It was not a huge difference, but it was a difference. When thousands of lives and millions of tons of cargo are at stake, a small statistical edge is a victory. The analysis suggested that Dazzle was most effective when the ship was being attacked on the bow, exactly the scenario it was designed to counter. The sheer variety of the designs is staggering. This was not a one-size-fits-all solution. Each ship class received its own unique patterns, tested and tailored to its specific silhouette. The USS Shaw, a destroyer, was famous for its zebra pattern of thin, wavy vertical lines designed to blur its outline against the water. The British battleship HMS Ramillies was covered in a powerful pattern of stark black and white blocks, giving it the appearance of a floating, ruined castle. The troopship SS Austerley had a more subtle but equally confusing scheme of greens and blues, with a jarring white shape on its bow to throw off any judgment of its course. The painters were working on a scale almost unimaginable for an artist. The hull of a ship is a vast, curved canvas. They were not just painting stripes, they were executing complex, three-dimensional designs that had to work from multiple viewing angles. Consider the Flower-class corvettes, small escort ships that were the workhorses of the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II. Many of them, like the MCS Sackville, were painted in what was known as the Western Approaches scheme, a pattern of white, pale blue, and pale green. It was a hybrid, part dazzle and part low visibility, designed to be effective in the specific weather conditions of the North Atlantic. This showed how the idea evolved. It wasn't just about confusing course anymore, it was about creating a pattern that was disruptive up close, but might also offer some concealment from a distance. The American Navy continued to refine the idea in the Second World War with their measure systems. Measure 32 was the official designation for a dazzle-type pattern. A ship like the aircraft carrier USS Wasp was painted in a Measure 32 scheme with huge geometric patches of different grays and blues. The goal was the same: to make it difficult for an enemy pilot or submarine commander to quickly identify the ship's type and heading. Other ships had even more specific designs. The destroyer USS Porter had a scheme with a false waterline painted on its hull, making it seem lighter and farther away than it actually was. The light cruiser USS Boise sported a pattern that broke its long, sleek hull into 2 or 3 smaller, nondescript shapes. Even the support ships got the treatment. The submarine tender USS Proteus had a particularly effective design of sweeping, intersecting curves that made it very difficult to perceive its true length or speed. Each of these 17 ships, from the mighty Olympic to the humble Kildongan, represents a piece of this grand, strange story. They were floating experiments in perception. They were a bet that human ingenuity and a touch of artistic madness could be a defense against, brute force. The fact that the idea persisted through 2 world wars, painted on thousands of ships, is a testament to the belief that it offered a genuine, if unquantifiable, advantage. Dazzle Camouflage faded away with the widespread adoption of radar and other electronic sensors. A radar pulse doesn't care about paint, it sees a solid metal object. But for a brief period in history, when naval warfare was still a matter of the human eye and the human brain, art went to war. It wasn't about beauty, it was about survival. It was about using one of humanity's most creative impulses to counter one of its most destructive. And it was, without a doubt, legitimately trippy. So, if Dazzle offered even a 1% improvement in survival rates and thousands of ships used it, does that mean we can attribute the survival of tens of thousands of sailors to this one artistic idea? Why was the concept abandoned so completely after World War II, when low-tech threats like mines and small boat attacks, where visual targeting is still key, remain a danger? And finally, what undiscovered optical illusions, what new ways of tricking the eye and the mind, are waiting in a modern artist's sketchbook, ready to become the next generation's Dazzle?